You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 306, The War in India. Last week, we looked at the Spanish takeover of Minorca in the Mediterranean Sea. While we in America think of the Revolutionary War in terms of fighting in America, that fighting also launched a larger war worldwide. When the European powers went to war, that meant open season on all of their colonies and outposts around the world. By 1781, Britain was at war with France, Spain, and the Netherlands. While Britain had lots of colonies and outposts to defend, it was not just fighting a defensive war. The government was always looking for vulnerable enemy real estate wherever it could seize some. By the 1780s, the Indian subcontinent provided many such targets. By this time, India had been a target of European colonization for nearly 3 centuries. The Portuguese established their first trading posts there in 1498. India at the time was made up of several kingdoms that were often at war with one another. Europeans, of course, took advantage of these divisions to establish alliances and build a system of control. By the early 1600s, both the Dutch and the English had established themselves on the subcontinent. Within a few decades, the Danes and the French also established themselves, and later even Sweden and Austria carved out some areas of control. As they did in other parts of the world, these European powers battled with both locals and each other for greater control. A Dutch power centered around Ceylon, a large island along the southeast coast of India. In addition, the Dutch had also settled several areas along the coast of the continent itself. The British East India Company held large areas of influence throughout India, but was particularly strong in the northeast area known as Bengal. They were also big in Madras. After France and Britain went to war in 1778, Britain attacked French colonies that were allied with the Kingdom of Mysore. Its first target was the French Indian capital of Pondicherry, which the British captured after a 2-month siege in 1778. This was just north of the Dutch area of control. At that time, though, 1778, Britain was not at war with the Dutch, so it didn't proceed any further. Shortly afterward, the British also took Mahé on the west coast from the French. Now, the French were not able to put many resources into their defenses in India, but the local French ally, the Kingdom of Mysore, was not simply ready to submit to British rule. Hyder Ali ruled Mysore at the time. He had allied himself with the French after the British, in his view, had betrayed him during an earlier war. Before the British took Mahé, Ali warned them that the area was under his protection and that they should stay out. The British, of course, ignored that warning and took it anyway. This kicked off what is known as the Second Anglo-Mysore War. The first one had been fought a decade earlier, when Ali and the Mysore Kingdom had first challenged the British. In July 1780, Ali assembled an army of 80,000, some sources actually say it's 100,000, and invaded the British-controlled Carnatic region of South India. The Mysore army burned villages and laid siege to several British forts in the area. This led to a major battle in September of 1780 against a British army of about 5,000 under the command of Colonel William Bally. The Mysore cavalry broke the British defensive lines and decimated the British army. At that time, it was one of the worst British defeats in India. The British retreated to Madras, leaving the Mysore to take control of the Carnatic. In July of 1781, a British force of about 8,000 attacked the coastal city of Porto Novo, where Ali defended the city with a force of about 40,000. The British commander, General ARP306, had spent decades fighting in India and was a pretty effective leader. I haven't been able to find much information on the battle itself, but the much smaller British force was able to capture Porto Novo, inflicting about 9,000 enemy casualties while taking about 300 of their own. My suspicion would be that the British use of Navy cannons and the lack of effective weaponry by the Mysore army led to this rather lopsided British victory. This was followed up by another British victory at Sholingher in September and several other battles. In the summer of 1781, Lord George Macartney arrived as the new governor of Madras. You may recall that we discussed Macartney before when he was governor of Grenada in the West Indies, when the French captured that island in 1779. At that point, Macartney had become a French prisoner of war, but was exchanged and sent back to London. 2 years later, he was on his way to his next post at Madras. When Macartney arrived in Madras, he brought with him the news that Britain had declared war on the Netherlands 6 months earlier. Apparently, no one among the Dutch or British leadership had received that news until Macartney's arrival in July of 1781. Governor Macartney then ordered the capture of any Dutch-controlled outposts in India. The first British target was the Dutch-controlled city of Negapatam. The Dutch governor there, Reinier van Vlissingen, had been unaware of the declared war with Britain until word arrived in that late summer of 1781. Up until that time, the Dutch had been fighting primarily against the Mysore under Hyder Ali. Earlier that year, Mysore soldiers had raided several villages under Dutch protection. The governor sent emissaries to meet with Ali and demand damages for these attacks. Instead, Ali took the emissaries hostage and demanded a ransom. He also threatened to capture and occupy several other Dutch outposts. In response, the Dutch commander Vlissingen was in discussions with the British at this time about forming an alliance with them against the Mysore. Of course, though, when word arrived of war between Britain and the Netherlands, all that changed. Despite having to pay a ransom to get the return of his emissaries, Vlissingen then reached out to Ali once again in hopes of forming an alliance with the Mysore against Britain. Ali was amenable to such an arrangement once he learned that the Dutch were in fact at war with his main enemy, Britain. After all, the enemy of my enemy, etc. Initially, Vlissingen sent 600 Dutch soldiers along with gunpowder and ammunition to Hyder's camp at Tanjore. When they learned that British forces were going to move against Negapatam, the Dutch soldiers returned to the city along with 2,100 Mysore soldiers. There, the armies were supplemented by another 5,500 local Indian militia. Because the British were fighting with the Mysore all over the region, they could not simply focus all of their forces on the Dutch target. In fact, the British commander, General Coote, did not want much of any of his army available to go what he regarded as a sideshow when he was focused on the main fight in the Carnatic. After some effort, Governor Macartney convinced General Hector Munro to take command of the force that was going to be called up against Negapatam. Munro was an experienced officer. He came from an aristocratic Scottish family, and he got his start in the military in the 1780s, hunting down and capturing Jacobite rebels during the Rising. By 1760, he was a major in the 89th Regiment of Foot, which was deployed to India. He spent nearly a decade there, fighting against Ali in the First Mysore War in the 1760s. He returned home in 1768 and was elected to Parliament. Munro made some big investments in a bank that failed in a financial crisis in 1772, and this may have been part of the reason that he decided to return to active duty in India a few years later. By late 1781, Munro had spent nearly 2 years of his return in active combat against the Mysore army. Once again, he had had enough, and he was ready to return home. That was when Governor Macartney tapped him to command the attack on Negapatam. To support Munro, Coote agreed to deploy an army under the command of Colonel John Braithwaite. Although Braithwaite had been injured in a recent battle, the soldiers under his command came to fight under the command of Colonel Eccles Nixon, and they marched to Negapatam. On October 20th, the British under Colonel Nixon, who were marching overland, seized 2 Dutch outposts at Caracal and Nagore. General Munro sailed with additional forces carried by the British Navy, commanded by Admiral Edward Hughes. The following week, October 27th, the British forces attacked the outer redoubts of the main Dutch defense at Negapatam. The defenders repulsed the British. The following day, the British brought more reinforcements for a second attempt and were repulsed a second time. Munro then attempted to attack the redoubts on the other side of the city. There, he was more successful, forcing a rout of the Mysorean cavalry. By the end of October, the Dutch retreated behind their city walls and prepared for a siege. The total British force consisted of about 4,000 soldiers, while the defenders had about 6,500. But the bulk of the defenders were local militia who were not considered to be as reliable in battle. Monroe had his men begin digging siege trenches around the city and bringing up cannons to take down the city walls. The Dutch attempted several sorties out of the city to prevent the setup of enemy artillery, but were largely unsuccessful. Even before the British arrived at Negapatam, the Dutch commander had sent word to Ali to send more Mysore soldiers to help lift the siege. A Mysorean relief army was near the town by November 8th. However, they were reluctant to launch an attack given the size of the British lines, and with the presence of British warships within cannon range of any attack. The Mysore leaders paused and called for even more reinforcements so that they could attack with an overwhelming force. As they waited, the British attacked the Mysore camp and forced the relief column to retreat on November 10th. Inside Negapatam, the Dutch were out of food and surrounded by the British Army and Navy. After a failed counterattack on the British lines on November 10th, Vlissingen called a council of war. The council agreed that the Dutch should surrender the following day. They came out under a flag of truce asking for terms. The two sides reached an agreement, and the next day, November 12th, the Dutch garrison surrendered. A day later, the larger Mysore army arrived, only to discover that it was too late to provide relief. It retreated back inland without engaging the British. Following the fall of Negapatam, the Mysore pulled back from the coast, where the British Navy could provide the British with a great advantage. The main British fleet that was present at Negapatam then moved on to the Dutch island of Ceylon. The British fleet carried several hundred volunteers, along with its marines, to capture the Dutch colony of Trincomalee. The fleet reached Trincomalee Bay on January 4, 1782. They landed an assault force several miles north of the Dutch Fort Frederick. Marching at night, they managed to enter the fort before the enemy even knew of their presence, taking the small 43-man garrison prisoner. The larger Fort Austenburg, however, controlled the harbor. By January 8th, the British took a hill above Fort Austenburg. Getting artillery onto that hill would prove difficult, so Admiral Hughes sent an emissary to call for the Dutch surrender of the fort. The Dutch governor, Imam Willem Falk, received the British officer, Major Giles, who demanded the fort's surrender. Falk refused the demand and sent Giles back to inform his commander. Major Giles was also an engineer, and he had used his time in the fort to observe its defenses and believed that the British could storm the fort instead of going through a lengthy siege. The following morning, a force of about 450, primarily made up of British Marines and seamen, stormed the fort with scaling ladders. After a brief battle, Fort Austenburg fell to the British. Admiral Hughes left a garrison, primarily made up of Indian soldiers, to take control of Trincomalee, while his fleet returned to Madras. The Dutch forces on the island were taken prisoner, and the Dutch governor, Falk, was granted parole to travel to the Dutch East Indies and report the loss of Trincomalee. The British success in India meant that both sides would soon be sending more resources there. Hughes had taken Trincomalee with 6 ships of the line. When he returned to Madras, he found 3 more ships had arrived, bringing his fleet to 9. About the same time Hughes was returning to Madras, a new French fleet was on its way. France had established its naval headquarters for the Indian Ocean at Ile-de-France, an island just off Mozambique, which is today known as Mauritius. In late 1781, a French fleet left Ile-de-France headed for India. Initially, the French targeted Trincomalee, but then decided to head straight at the British fleet at Madras. Admiral Thomas d'Estaing de Orve commanded the French fleet. However, he became very ill during the voyage and turned over command to Admiral Pierre-André de Suffren. The fleet included 11 ships of the line, as well as 6 smaller fighting vessels. Along the way, the fleet captured a British ship of the line, the 50-gun Hannibal, which they also pressed into French service. In early February, the French fleet reached Madras and began raiding coastal towns and villages. Shortly after their arrival, French Admiral d'Orve succumbed to his illness and died. Admiral Suffren continued on with the campaign. After discovering the British fleet at Madras, Suffren sailed further south. He realized that the defenses at Madras would negate against an attack directly on the fleet. Instead, he planned to land at Porto Novo, then march back up the coast and capture enemy villages along the way. Near the landing point, Suffren discovered that the British fleet under Hughes had in fact followed him down the coast and was prepared to do battle there. The British fleet was smaller and now away from its defenses at Madras, but it did manage to catch the French fleet out of position. Initially, the British took on 5 French ships of the line, and eventually 2 more French ships joined the battle, but the other French ships just remained out of the battle, just watching. Several British ships were badly damaged and close to sinking. Again, inexplicably, the French ships ended their attack before sinking several of the British ships. Although the British were able to inflict considerable damage on the French fleet, Admiral Hughes realized that he was outgunned and sailed away that night under cover of darkness. His fleet sailed from Trincomalee to make repairs. The battle losses in what became known as the Battle of Sadras were pretty even. Both fleets lost about 130 killed and wounded. Suffren did not immediately give chase. He met with his ship commanders to scold those who had failed to enter the battle, and then went ashore to meet with Hyder Ali and to land his armies on the coast. French soldiers joined with Ali's Mysorean soldiers and began a siege at Cuddalore. After both fleets had had time to make repairs, they both set out in search of one another for another battle. The fleets spotted each other on April 8th. Many of Hughes's crew by this time were sick with scurvy, and he actually hoped to avoid battle, but Suffren gave chase. On the morning of April 12th, realizing that he could not avoid a fight, Hughes formed his ships into a line of battle. It took hours for both fleets to get into position, and the 2 lines joined in battle by about 1:30 in the afternoon. Both lines blasted each other with broadsides, inflicting considerable damage at pretty close range. The British took the heaviest casualties, suffering nearly 600 killed and wounded. There are conflicting reports on the French casualties, but it was somewhere between maybe 350 and 550 killed and wounded. A rainstorm at about 5:30 p.m. finally forced the 2 lines to separate and withdraw. For the next few weeks, both fleets remained within a few miles of each other, but both were too badly damaged to renew the battle. The French considered renewing the fight almost a week later on April 19th, but after seeing the condition of the enemy fleet, decided to sail away. The British fleet might have looked formidable, but if it was a bluff. Several British ships of the line were barely afloat and were maintained by skeleton crews because so many sick and wounded had been pulled off to hospital ships. The French retreated to the Dutch port of Batacalo in modern-day Sri Lanka. Once again, the 2 fleets separated for a time to make repairs, and then set sail again in search of one another. The French fleet departed Batacalo for Cuddalore, which had fallen to France's Mysorean allies. There, Ali asked the French Admiral Suffren to attack Negapatam, which was the same town that the British had captured 8 months earlier, and which I discussed at the beginning of this episode. Suffren would not participate in a land attack, but agreed to engage the British Navy off the coast there. On July 11th, 1782, Hughes anchored near Negapatam with his 11 ships of the line, when Suffren arrived with 12 ships. Hughes had received intelligence that the French fleet was on its way, so he was prepared for battle. The following day, the 2 fleets formed lines and fought yet another pretty destructive, yet largely indecisive battle. This time, however, the British fleet was much more aggressive. Now, there's some dispute after the battle. The British claimed that the Sevier had struck her colors during the battle, meaning that she was a British prize. The captain of the Sevier disputed this, claiming that the British had simply shot away the halyards, causing the colors to fall, and that they were then raised again. So the British left without their prize. A court-martial of events later held in Paris determined that the captain had in fact struck his colors, but that his subordinate officers were horrified at the idea of surrender and had risen the colors again. Suffren actually sent 3 of his captains back home for court-martial. The 2 others avoided censure, but the captain of the Sevier was cashiered from the Navy. The war in India would continue on land and sea for even a year after the American Revolution ended, and we'll have to return to some of those further adventures in India in a later episode. Next week, however, we return to America as General George Washington makes plans to kidnap a future King of England. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. Be sure to check out the Sons podcast at fastfunhistory.com. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, TJ Walker and Curtis Johnson, and welcome to our newest supporter on Patreon at the Robert Morris Circle, Richard McCabe, who joined us last month. I am also thankful to Mark Ulmer for a generous one-time gift via Zelle. I really do appreciate everyone who provides financial support to allow me to produce this podcast. Those who support me on Patreon at the standard bearer level or higher, that's $10 a month, will receive a magnet each month with a different flag from the Revolutionary War. It's just my way of saying thank you for your support. For anyone listening to this during the week of its release, I also want to remind you of our live Zoom roundtable on Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. Our topic this month will be plans for the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Revolution. I've asked several people to join us for the event who are on planning committees around the country. Now, the 250th will probably hit its peak in 2026 when we celebrate the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There's lots of big plans in store over the next coming years, though. Please join our discussion. If you need a Zoom link, you can email me. Everyone on my mailing list has already received the link. If you're not on my mailing list, please visit my website to use the MailChimp link to add yourself. I also wanted to mention that I plan to attend a lecture series at the Indian King Tavern Museum in April in Haddonfield, New Jersey. This is looking at some of the archaeological work that's being done at Red Bank Battlefield Park. It's a series, I think there's 3 or 4 of them. The lectures are free and open to the public, so feel free to join me. If you need details, let me know. Again, I've provided those details to those on my mailing list. Now, before I get into this week's discussion, I have one correction from last week. I referred to Port Mahon as an area where the British were set up at Minorca. It was pointed out to me that my mispronunciation was so bad that it confused some listeners who were familiar with the island. It should have been Mahon. I'm pretty confident I butchered some other names last week, and probably did this week as well. I have a hard enough time pronouncing English words correctly, let alone foreign words. So, for everyone who cringed at my pronunciation of Port Mahon, I apologize, and I'll apologize in advance for any other mistakes I made with all the foreign names I had to deal with this week. Now, this week and last week, we talked about events far away from North America. Last week was the Mediterranean, this week was India. Now, today, we tend to think of India as being dominated by Britain in the colonial era. And while Britain did have a presence there during the Revolutionary War, the real domination, as we think of it, didn't take hold until the early 1800s. And General Cornwallis actually plays a big role in that after leaving the American Revolution. It seems to me that Britain began to focus on India more after losing its colonies in America. And of course, there were lots of other factors, including the introduction of tea plants to India beginning in the 1820s. My book recommendation is an older book called The Dutch East India Company and Mysore, 1762 to 1790, by Jan van Luysen. It covers events from the Dutch perspective and gets into great detail about the Mysore kingdom under Hyder Ali, which we talked about this week. This book was first published in 1961, but it is still available. And it's interesting, we talk a lot about the British East India Company, but there was a Dutch East India Company as well, and these two companies were competitors in worldwide trade for centuries. My online recommendation is an even older book called The History of British India, specifically Volume 4 by James Mill. This one was published in 1840 and is available as a free download on archive.org, as it is in the public domain. I specifically chose Volume 4, obviously, because it covers the era that's related to what we discussed this week, but this is a multi-volume set on the history of Britain in India, and it's, I think, a pretty interesting look. This history was actually being published when Britain was at its close to its high point of domination within India. My question this week asks, did Betsy Ross really make the first American flag? Well, I've alluded to this when I first discussed the creation of the flag in 1777. There are some myths surrounding the story, and separating facts from fiction is not entirely possible in this case. Now, for starters, we know that Betsy Ross was a real person. She was born Elizabeth Griscom in Gloucester, New Jersey, which is just a few miles from Philadelphia. While working as an apprentice upholsterer in Philadelphia, she met and married John Ross. Her husband joined the Army and died in 1775. Now, it's unclear exactly how he died, but it does not appear to be battle-related. John's uncle, George Ross, was a delegate to the Continental Congress. Now, Betsy married again in 1777 and a third time in 1780 and outlived all three of her husbands. She had at least 7 children, and the house where she lived in Philadelphia is still there today, just a few blocks from Independence Hall. While working as a widow, Betsy earned a living as a seamstress and an upholsterer. The Pennsylvania state government found several accounting entries paying Betsy Ross to make flags in 1777. Now, that's all we know about with any real certainty. The story that attributes more to Betsy Ross says that in 1776, a congressional delegation visited Betsy's home to discuss the creation of a new flag. In that delegation was George Washington. The delegates worked together to sketch out the details of the new flag, and Ross's contribution to this discussion was the suggested use of a 5-point star instead of the traditional 6 points. Now, the first publication of this story came out well after the fact, in 1870, long after everyone was dead. The presenter was a man named William Canby, who was Betsy's grandson. He claimed that the stories were part of an oral family history. He had heard this story from several of Betsy's daughters, who were born after the incident in question, but were also dead by the time this paper was read publicly. One niece was still alive at the time he made the presentation in 1870, but she was only a baby at the time of the purported events. Critics will point out that Congress first passed a resolution regarding the flag in 1777, not 1776, and that Washington had not been a delegate to the Continental Congress since he left to command the Army in 1775. They will also note that Ross never received any recorded payment for making a Stars and Stripes, and that another delegate, Francis Hopkinson, claimed credit for the flag's design in 1780. Now, none of these criticisms are actually fatal to Ross's story. Washington was in fact in Philadelphia for much of 1776 and was there at the time of the supposed meeting. It's not impossible that he and a few other delegates discussed flag design well in advance of when the flag was ultimately approved by Congress, and Hopkinson may have played a role in this along with Ross. Washington was known as being a real stickler for details, and the fact that he would be very interested in making sure that a design of a flag would be done to his specifications is certainly well within his character. Now, the problem, of course, with saying it's possible is that there's no definitive proof either way. There are no Stars and Stripes that survive from this era, and the picture we have of what we call the Betsy Ross flag with a circle of 5-pointed stars does not exist, and no drawing of it exists until an 1890 painting based on the Betsy Ross story was first drawn, and that, of course, was drawn by the artist's imagination. Now, it's quite possible that the Ross family used the kernel of truth that Ross had made flags for the government and added the exaggerations and flourishes to the story over time. The truth is, we just don't know, and we probably will never know with any certainty. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.